There's a lot you can learn from Out of the Past.
Hi, everybody. Jim Marushin here, curator of the Martin County Historical Society, with another episode of the Historical Society's Out of the Past. With me, as always, is our executive director, Lenny Tweeden. Lenny, how you doing today?
Very good. We're going to see an episode on Dan Kerberg and Ludke Slough controversy back in the 1970s.
Oh, sure.
But before we get into that, what'd you bring along today?
Well, I got a few things here. The first is a nice jacket, which is from Northland Beverage. Lenny, do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, they delivered what, 7-Up and
7-Up, yeah.
maybe others too. I'm not sure if they did other beverages or not.
I don't really remember, but I just thought it was a neat looking item.
Yeah, very good. Very neat. Definitely.
Then I've also got from our new Interlochen Golf Club display, the 1919 trophy.
Yeah, and we should say that display is really excellently laid out in the museum.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks to Vandy War, we've got all a great deal of memorabilia from the Interlochen Golf.
Yeah, this one's interesting. It says Interlochen Golf and Boat Club.
Yeah, that's new to me.
Yeah, original piece of stock. We got this wonderful scorecard from the 1980s.
And Van spent a lot of time putting that book together. It's excellent book. It's very well done. I think we have a number of them at the museum if anybody's interested.
Absolutely, yep. Great read, a lot of history on the golf club. Well, Lenny, what say we get into the interview?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
We're in the schoolroom of the Pioneer Museum. Today I'm going to visit with Dan Kerberg, a bit about the Ludke Slough. But first of all, Dan, where are you from originally and what brought you to Fairmont?
I grew up in northwest Iowa, went to high school there, went to college there, then moved around the country a little bit, getting a master's degree, and I ended up obtaining a job at Fairmont High School, where I was the high school biology teacher for 34 years. I came in 1967, and that was when the city was starting their dredging program.
Okay, you've probably seen a lot of changes during that period of time. You talked about the dredging program. Tell us a little bit about that. What was the situation involving that?
Well, as I understand it, the city council back in 1960 decided they needed to increase the reservoir for the drinking water. Of course, Fairmont takes its drinking water from Bud Lake, and the lake was not very deep at that time, and they were concerned they were going to run out of water, so they decided they'd deepen the lakes with a dredging program. So I think it started in 1965, they started dredging, and they started on the north end of the chain with George Lake and then into Sisseton Lake. And of course, when you dredge, you have to find a disposal site for the silt they're removing from the bottom of the lake. And for George Lake, I think they deposited it on the west side of George Lake, north of the cemetery there. And then in Sisseton Lake, they went to the Day Farm site where the present community gardens are, and they deposited some of the silt there. And then in 1969, they wanted to start dredging Bud Lake, and the proposal was from the city to put that into Ludke Slough. Well, I came in 67, and I had some training in aquatic ecology and limnology, the study of freshwater, and I knew the value of wetlands. And so I kind of protested, I guess, the idea of filling in Ludke Slough. And so that's how this whole controversy started. Now, if you want, I can explain how the dredge worked a little bit.
I was just going to ask you that, because, you hear dredging, and I hear it too, but do all of us really know what it is and how it takes place? So, yeah, I think if you can go through that and give us an example.
I built a little rudimentary model of a dredge here, which is not very good, but a dredge was 51 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was like a great big pontoon. It had a great big diesel engine right here mounted on the back, and it had a long boring auger here with a suction pipe around it, and the diesel engine would draw the water up from that boring tool and then run it out through this pipe. And this, if people remember, there were barrels sitting across the lake, and this pipe would take it to the disposal site. Maybe you can hold that in there, Lenny. That would take it to the disposal site. And then they had another pipe. You take this one back. So this would return the water back to the lake. So from the dredge, it would take it to the far end of the disposal site, and then this would bring it back from the near end, and as the water trickled across the disposal site, all the silt would settle out, and clean water would trickle back to the lakes. Now, in order to make the dredge operate, they had big pylons in the front of it. It had a motor driven in the back that would move it ahead, but these things would go up and down and would stick in the mud. So as this one went down and the motor would drive it ahead, it would cause it to pivot. So the auger would pivot this way, then they'd raise this one up, put this one down, and then they'd go back the other way, and they'd keep sweeping across the lake back and forth like that, sucking up the silt from the bottom and taking it to the disposal site. So that's how the dredge operated, and it would take years. They'd take 2 or 3 feet at a time, and they went from a depth of about 8 or 10 feet to near 20 feet in most of the lakes. In Hall Lake, they actually went to about 26 feet. So that's basically how the dredge operated. It was just a big suction pump to suction the silt out of the bottom of the lake.
And that was going to be deposited in the slough, like you said.
And the proposal was, yes, to separate to deposit the silt in the bottom of Ludke Slough. So in 1969, they started draining the Ludke Slough, and that's when we got involved. Dennis Hansen worked for the Department of Natural Resources, and he and I were the 2 main leaders in this preservation effort.
Okay, let me back up a minute. Draining the slough.
They needed to drain the water out of the slough so they could put enough water and silt in there.
Okay. Where did they drain it to?
They were draining it back into the lake.
Oh,
they had a reservoir that went back into the lake.
Just a round robin type of thing.
Yeah. So just as the water, when stuff came out of the dredge, it was primarily water, and it was a slurry of water and mud. And then as they sent it to the far end of the disposal site, the water would trickle back, mud would settle out, called silt would settle out, and then the water would trickle back to the lake. And so they needed to dredge that out so the water could trickle back. So they started emptying it, and Dennis Hansen, who worked for the DNR, got the DNR to have an injunction against the city, preventing them from draining the water. And that's how the whole controversy started. And from there on, we had a 4-year battle with DNR on one side, me as a local leader on the community side, and then the city council, of course. And the reason they wanted to do this is because it was cheaper. You know, the disposal site was close to the lake, and consequently it was fairly inexpensive for them to move the piping and the dredging without booster pumps to the nearest site. If they had to save Ludke Slough and they had to find an alternative site, which would be farther away, it was obviously going to be more expensive. So they didn't want to do that.
So, as a biology teacher, then, what was your primary reason for wanting to conserve that area?
A number of reasons. First of all, there's certainly wildlife habitat in any marsh and wetlands area. I mean, fish spawning, and not so much in Ludke Slough, but wetlands in general are fish spawning, duck habitat, wildlife, wildflowers, birds, migratory birds. So there's a lot of habitat there. Secondly, any marsh acts as a nutrient filter. Now what that means is the phosphates and the nitrates that come from farmers' fields or our lawns get into a wetland and it grows cattails and marsh plants and duckweed and algae in the slough. And therefore, when the water comes back to the lake, those nutrients are not in the lake and we have fewer algae blooms in our lakes. So marshes tend to clean up lakes. They act as a kidney in your body. They filter out the bad stuff and bring back clean water into the lake.
Okay, so following that injunction, what took place then, or what was the next step?
Well, the city then asked the district court to intervene and see if they could establish the right to go ahead with their dredging program. The district court asked for a hearing, and that hearing was held with the Water Resources Board, and the Water Resources came and had an actual hearing, legal, with lawyers and testimony and a very serious situation. And the Water Resources Board, after 2 days of hearings, ruled that the city could go ahead and dredge and drain Ludke Slough. That's where we were then, to drain the slough. And after that was all done, The DNR then discovered that the Water Resources Board ruling specified that there had to be a portion of Ludke Slough left as a nature center. So that kind of threw a monkey wrench into the city's plans. And so things were just delayed. And it went on for a number of years with hearings, injunctions, and court proceedings, lawyers talking with the DNR. And so consequently, it got delayed for a period of time. And so in 1970, I'm not sure about this year, I think it was 1971, the actual dredging didn't happen. It was delayed and no dredging took place for a whole year.
So you had the DNR involved, the Water Resources Board, the City of Fairmont.
That's correct, and with lawyers, and it ultimately came down where I think everybody got pretty tired. This has gone on for over 3 years now, and a lot of controversy. One of the things that I think is interesting about this is we were written up in the B section of the Minneapolis Tribune, and we were the lead article in the B section of the Minneapolis Tribune, and we were heading to district court to get a final ruling on this, and I needed a lawyer. We needed some attorneys to go to court, and so on a whim, I just called the Sierra Club, the national environmental group, the Sierra Club, and I think they were in Minnesota at that time establishing Voyageurs National Park. And they must have read that article in the Minneapolis Tribune, because when I called them and asked if I could get an attorney, I was from a little town in southern Minnesota. They said, "Are you the guy that was written up in the Minneapolis Tribune?" And I said, "Yes, I was." And they said, "No worries, we'll have an attorney for you whenever you need us." So that was kind of reassuring. And I think when the city heard that, they were tired of all the negotiations and the goings on, and we were certainly tired after 3 years of doing this. And I think the result was, let's settle. So the result was that we would allow them to build a berm, a dike across, and that dike is built from behind Hertzke Construction east to the school maintenance building, and north of that was filled in. So originally the slough went up clear to the Baptist church and to the aquatic park. The dog park was all part of Ludke Slough. That is all now filled with silt from Bud Lake. But south of that, 2/3 of the slough was retained in its natural form. So we got a compromise out of the situation where we did save a big portion of it. And I guess we were happy to get that much saved.
Throughout the course of the entire situation, what kind of support did you get?
Very little. Locally, it was probably 99% of the people would be against it. Back then, you got to think now, this is back in 1968, 69, 70. Marshes and sloughs were regarded as dirty old stinky potholes. There was not what I call a wetland ethic. People didn't know the value of wetlands and how they were better for our lakes if we had them around there. And in fact, 99% of all the marshes in Minnesota have been drained and are being farmed. So and consequently some of our lakes have greater algae problems because of that. So the nutrient filter part of it, the resulting habitat that's gone, we've seen a decrease in wildlife. We've certainly seen a more polluted lakes because we don't have the wetlands.
Was part of your goal to conserve that as maybe an environment for teaching,
We
for
did.
education?
We did. I taught a summer school biology class for over 30 years, and my kids all went down there and waded in that mud at Ludke Slough. They didn't like it, but they did it, and we collected little beasties out of the water, and we made them go back to the microscopes back in the lab and see a whole new world of life. You people might relate this to, if you've ever gone scuba diving or snorkeling in a coral reef, you notice there's a whole new realm of life in that coral reef that we've not been acquainted with. Well, the same thing is true of all the little aquatic animals that are microscopic in wetlands and sloughs. They're just a fantastic number of little beasties, I call them, in the water that are part of the food chain, that serve an ultimate real value to all the habitat that's there.
Were there any public institutions that supported you? I mean, the school board, the city council, were they mixed on their support or non-support, or what was the situation
Of course,
there?
most of the people in the city were against what I was trying to do. They wanted to fill the slough. The school board was in support of me. I actually had a person go to the school board and ask for my job, thought I should be fired because of what I was doing here. And the school board supported our efforts, and I thanked them for that. But it was a pretty controversial time at that time. There were a lot of articles in the paper against what we were doing. Of course, John Livermore wrote a number of editorials that
He was a colorful character.
he was a colorful character. He was a past legislator, and he had some authority and had some weight.
Yeah.
And he fought violently to have me ousted. So it was a tough time.
And looking back at some of those articles, I noticed that there was quite a number of supporters from outside of the area.
Most of the support that we got came from outside. Local support was minimal, very minimal. A lot of support from outside. We even got a letter from Walter Mondale in support. We got letters from various people who were involved in nature programs from around the state. So it was encouraging to see some of that, but it was also kind of discouraging to see the lack of support from the local
area.
But like I say, people didn't know the wetland ethic at that time. They just thought sloughs were dirty old smelly holes and didn't realize the value of them.
Did you ever feel like throwing in the towel?
Certainly. I knew what I was doing was the right thing, but there were a lot of very personal attacks, and that made it kind of difficult for my wife and I. We suffered through a lot of chastisement and ridicule and attacks that were, in the paper, on the radio.
Unnecessary.
And they thought they were necessary. I didn't think they were necessary, but it certainly happened, and it was difficult for us. Yes.
I would imagine your colleagues at the high school were supportive.
They were the same as the other people. They didn't really want to get involved. There wasn't a lot of support from, I think our science staff was, but other than that, I'm not sure that, it was just like everybody else. They weren't aware.
Sure. Okay, Dan, thinking back over that period of time, what are some highlights that you can recall?
Well, I can think of two. One was Marlon Grass was a highly respected person in town and was mayor. And before he passed away, he came to me and he said, Dan, you were right with Lutke Slough. The city was wrong, and we're glad you did what you did. And I was thankful that somebody did that. He's the only person from the city that ever came to me and sort of reinforced what we had done. So I appreciated that. A second highlight might be the fact that Lutke Slough is still being used today as part of the East Side Storm Sewer Project. So storm sewers from all of the east side of Fairmont empty into that little retaining pond by Bethel Church and the clinic. And then from there it empties into Lutke Slough, where again, the phosphates and nitrates are used up in the slough, and before the water goes back into the lake, it's cleaner, and therefore we prevent more algae blooms and bad situations in our lakes. So I think those are two highlights that I would say resulted from what we did.
So actually what you've done, your efforts ended up being very positive. And as far as from my personal perspective, I live across the street from the slough and that whole area, and I appreciate the wildlife and the way everything is in that area.
Well, yeah, that's true. And of the supporters we had back in that time, like I say, there were few, but 2 or 3 of them were slough residents, like you were.
They were.
And so consequently, they wanted to save it because they enjoyed what they saw every day at the slough.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for the interview and for what you've done over that period of time and for all your efforts in saving the slough. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Lenny. I appreciate it.
Well, Lenny, that was quite the interview. Growing up in Fairmont, I had no idea that was such a big controversy at the time.
Well, I think today a lot of people weren't aware of that, but at the time it was really a controversy. And Dan, I have to give him credit for sticking up for that and sticking to his guns about the Lutke Slough saving it. He had a lot of opposition.
Sure.
and felt a lot of pressure, but he stuck with it. And I think as a result, we've got a beautiful picturesque area there now. And
Yeah.
so he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Absolutely. Well, kudos to him for doing that, and a big thank you to Dan for the interview and for the presentation he did at the museum earlier. Really great stuff, great history to learn about. And this has been a great episode. We thank you all as well for coming to watch. Please join us again for our next episode of Out of the Past.
There's a lot you can learn from Out of the Past.